Did 18th century Scotland have a cannibal earl who was just 8 years old when he committed his heinous crime in what is now one of the country's most famous buildings? And is that building haunted by his actions? This is the strange tale of the supposedly mad, bad and homicidally dangerous James Douglas, Earl of Drumlanrig, later 3rd Marquess of Queensberry. The disturbing tale of James Douglas, the son and heir of the 2nd Duke of Queensberry, who was originally known by his father's subsidiary title of Earl of Drumlanrig, takes us back to the late Stuart era and to Scotland's capital city. Born on the 2nd of November 1697 to the Duke and his wife, the former Mary Boyle, little James was their second child, but the older boy had already died as a baby. He would also have numerous younger siblings, including a brother named Charles, born in November 1698. The earliest mention I can find of the supposedly horrific crime he committed as a youngster comes from the Complete Peerage published in 1895, which uses outdated language to describe mental health issues, a problem you'll see in other sources in this video too, I'm afraid, and which says that he was called the cannibalistic idiot from a terrible incident which occurred about the year 1707 when he was left at home one day with a young boy who acted as a turnspit, whom he actually spitted and roasted alive and was found eating. For its source for this information, the Complete Peerage gives only M.J. Shaw Stewart, who was a 19th century British government official, but I am unable to trace the information any further. Details are suspiciously sparse here. Where was this home, for instance? What was the turnspit's name? Where were the other servants in the ducal household, which would have had dozens upon dozens of staff members at the very least? How could a 9-year-old kill another child and manage to put a dead body on the spit, which, as a noble boy, and apparently a mentally impaired one at that, he would have had no reason to know how to use? And why can I not find any mention of this incident until about 188 years after it supposedly happened? Surely such an appalling occurrence would have created an absolute storm, even in the early 18th century. They had newspapers back then, after all. I can't offer an answer to most of these questions, but what I can tell you is that the Complete Peerage adds that James was an idiot, probably from his birth, but certainly before June 1706, when he was passed over in the entail of the estates, as also in that of the titles of Duke of Queensberry, etc. What the writer is referring to here is the fact that the 2nd Duke of Queensberry did resign his lands and most of his titles in 1706 and had them reassigned on the 17th of June that year. Now, none of the official contemporary sources I could find relating to this said that it was done in order to cut James out of his inheritance, nor do I have any source from within the family saying it either. When I read the act which ratified the charter that dealt with the reassignment of the titles and lands, it offered no motive and did not mention James or his siblings. Perhaps there is some other paperwork somewhere that discusses it though, and which I didn't come across. You'd really need an expert in early 18th century Scottish history to be truly sure what was going on here. I did think it strange that when I looked at this act of ratification online, then scrolled down the page, I saw other nobles apparently resigning and being regranted lands too. And I wondered if it had anything to do with the Act of Union between England/Wales and Scotland, which was then being hammered out and was finalised in 1707. That may just be a coincidence though, and there is one near contemporary source I came across which tied the change to the Queensberry inheritance to James's health problems. But it does not originate from within the family or any government department, and you'll need to stay till the end to hear more about it. What is undoubtedly significant, though, is that in 1708, when Queensberry was created the Duke of Dover in the British peerage, he obtained a special remainder which allowed that title to be inherited by his third son Charles, who had already been gifted a series of titles back in 1706, including being made the Earl of Solway. These were in recognition of his father and grandfather's efforts on behalf of the crown. Now, the fact that these honours went to Charles would suggest that something was wrong with second son James, though the need for the special remainder in 1708 indicates that he was still alive at that point, otherwise why bother having the remainder? The issue of when he actually died is something we'll discuss in more detail in a few minutes, by the way. Encyclopaedia Britannica from 1911 certainly attributes this remainder to James's mental problems, saying that it was done because the boy, quote, was an idiot. But again, like so many other sources, that was written hundreds of years after the event. What about the cannibal story, though? Is there any other information about it? Well, the other source I've located for it, which you will see cited all over the internet if you Google this tale, was published just 7 years after the complete peerage and is a 1902 book by Herbert Maxwell called The History of the House of Douglas. In it, he refers to riots which took place in Edinburgh in the run-up to the Union. These were driven by concerns amongst many that, among other things, Scotland was losing its parliament and becoming subservient to England, issues which are still debated today. Now, we know from other sources that these riots occurred in October 1706 outside Parliament House in the Old Town area of the city, which was very close to the Douglas family home of Queensberry House and also to the royal residence Holyrood Palace, which sits at the end of the Royal Mile. According to Maxwell, it was during this turmoil that the shadow of a great horror fell upon the Duke's household. For, quote, his eldest son, Lord Drumlanrig, having become a dangerous lunatic, was kept in confinement in a cellar of Holyrood Palace. During the riots in Edinburgh, which took place while the debates on the Union Act were in progress, the Duke's servants had run out to witness the exciting scenes in the streets and left the lunatic unguarded. He escaped from his cell and wandered through the palace till he came upon a luckless cookboy turning the spit in the kitchen. Him he attacked at once, killed, spitted, and roasted him before his own fire. This unhappy lord survived his father, and had the law then stood as it does now, the family honours and dignity of Duke must have been inherited by the lunatic. But Queensberry prudently exerted the power possessed by peers of Scotland before the Union. Resigning into the hands of the sovereign his dukedom and the lands of the duchy, he obtained a regrant thereof, whereby the succession was fixed upon his third son, Charles, Earl of Solway, who succeeded as 3rd Duke of Queensberry in 1711. Some details here differ to those in the complete peerage. The action takes place in Holyrood House, the inferred date is different and much more specific. There is no mention of cannibalism. We are told that the child was usually locked up in a cellar and only escaped because the staff had left him unattended, and we hear nothing of the Duke of Dover title with its special remainder. Like the complete peerage, there are a lot of problems with this source. It too offers no contemporary evidence to support its claims, lacks a lot of details, and stretches credulity and common sense. Why would Queensberry's lunatic child have been in a cellar in Holyrood Palace when his father's own house was just up the street, where he could be cared for more privately by family servants? How could an entire palace worth of servants all be out of the building at once, save one cookboy? I've never heard of such a thing unless the building was on fire and being evacuated. They could all have been dismissed for leaving it so poorly attended. How could a still 8-year-old boy, because in this version of events that's all he would have been, have escaped his prison cell, etc., etc.? Here I refer you back to the problems and unanswered questions that I listed after discussing the complete peerage version of this story, all of which could apply here too. The whole thing reads like a dark fairy tale. What's more, when you go searching for more information, you start to see even more different versions of this tale. Let's start with Wikipedia, that great bastion of misinformation, which at the point of this video's creation places the action in Queensberry House at the time of the Act of Union's signing, which would be the spring of 1707, and which says that the young Earl, then aged about 10, was a cannibal. This all conflicts with what Maxwell said, despite the fact that it cites his book, while the only other citations are to random websites with no primary source or even an older, reputable secondary source. The complete peerage doesn't get a look in. No doubt copying Wikipedia's version of the tale, the story of the cannibal Earl of Queensberry House has popped up in countless other places on the internet, including news outlets which peddle the tale that the building might have a ghost connected to this horrific slaying, and that you can still see the oven that the unfortunate servant boy was roasted in, despite the fact that he was actually meant to have been put on a spit. Nowhere do we get more details about what supposedly happened or the name of the murdered kitchen boy, which might enable us to trace him in royal staff account books or with a death or burial notice. Scotland's genealogical records are some of the best in the world and have birth, marriage, death and burial records going back not just to the early 18th century, but well beyond. In short, gang, this all smells of cow poop to me. I see no real evidence that this disturbing incident ever took place, and I wonder if it was invented as a slander on the Duke of Queensberry's family because his involvement in pushing the union through made him very unpopular with many. So if I don't believe in the cannibal story, why am I not ending the video here? Well, it's because the story of the real James Douglas is still quite the little mystery, with conflicting evidence about what happened to him and indications that at least some of what the complete peerage and Maxwell said was true. Just before I explain what I mean by that though, please remember to like, hype and comment on the video and subscribe with notifications on to keep up to date with all things History Calling. You can also join as a channel member for members-only posts and badges next to your name in the comments, or find me on patreon.com/historycalling, where I release bonus material every week, including early access to ad-free videos and patron-only podcasts. Also, we just have a very friendly, nice little community over there of like-minded history lovers. For more from me, you can also get my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, to help you trace your Irish heritage if you have any. Records aren't as good as they are for Scotland, but they're also not as bad as the pessimists would have you believe. The book is available from Amazon and I'll leave it linked below for you. If you do buy, I'd be very grateful if you'd leave it a review, as this is super helpful for other buyers and for the Amazon algorithm, but it's something that hardly anyone does. Last but not least, for some freebies, sign up to my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, to get 2 complimentary downloads right away, plus my newsletter. Do check the welcome email you'll get upon sign up doesn't go to junk mail, and if it does, just assign messages from my email account as not spam, or add the email address to your contacts list so that the newsletter doesn't get dumped in the trash as well. Now then, what's the big mystery about James Douglas, Earl of Drumlanrig's death? Death and burial records suggest that Lord Drumlanrig did indeed outlive his father and did have mental health problems. The second Duke of Queensberry died in 1711, and if we look at the registers of the parish church of Calverley, which were published in 1880, we find a death record from 4 years later in 1715 for, quote, James Douglas, Marquess of Drumlanrig, died at Woodall January 24th, buried at Lounsborough on the 17th of February. In a footnote attached to this registration, the editor says that the boy was the imbecile eldest son of the second Duke of Queensberry, that he appears to have died at Woodhall whilst under the care of Mr. Richardson, whoever that was, for the editor gives no further information, and that he was never Marquess of Drumlanrig, but rather the Earl of the same, for no such marquisate ever existed. Another source, though, the records of burials at Calverley, says that he was buried there on the 17th of February, and also refers to him as an imbecile, but as the Earl of Drumlanrig. I don't know who to believe about his burial location. Both the options given of Calverley and Lounsborough are in Yorkshire, England, by the way, but here we have a contemporary source calling him an imbecile, and while there is a little discrepancy about his burial location, these death records are clear that he expired in 1715. There therefore really should be no debate on that, and yet there are a host of other sources which muddy the waters on this point and don't even mention his supposed mental state. Burke's Peerage is a very famous list of supposedly all the nobility in the British Isles, but one which has been known to make errors, notably around mentally unwell people. It famously said in 1963 that 2 of Elizabeth II's maternal cousins had died when in fact they were alive and in a hospital for mentally ill people, and continued there until their actual deaths in 1986 and 2014. So take with a grain of salt the fact that Burke's Peerage of 1826 makes no mention of James Douglas, nor does the edition of 1909, instead saying only that the second Duke of Queensberry was succeeded by his eldest surviving son, meaning Charles. This doesn't actually prove that James was dead at that point, and could mean that he was seen as an embarrassment to the family and was written out of their history. Now, I found this airbrushing of his existence quite interesting and began backtracking through other historical sources to see what they said about him as well, especially as I got closer and closer to his lifetime. Edmund Lodge's The Genealogy of the Existing British Peerage, published in 1832, said that the Duke of Queensberry's son Charles outlived his older two brothers, who both died young, but also says that he was the second surviving son in 1706 when he was made Earl of Solway, suggesting that James was still alive at that point. It also doesn't tell us when James died. I did find it interesting, though, that it mentions that his father, quote, obtained in 1706 a renewed patent of the dukedom and the titles granted with it to his father in 1684, limiting them to his heirs of entail, male or female, succeeding to the estate of Queensberry, provided such heirs were descended from the body of William, 1st Earl of Queensberry, and he afterwards executed an entail of this estate on the heirs of line. What's particularly interesting to me is that there's no mention here of needing to do any of this because of a mentally disabled son. I then moved back in time again to John Debrett's The Peerage of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The edition published in 1828 said only that the second Duke of Queensberry had 3 sons and 3 daughters who died young, but mentioned none of them by name. Its earlier 1814 edition, though, did name James and said that he died in 1707. Curiouser and curiouser. Back in my time machine I got and headed to Francis Nichol's The British Compendium or Rudiments of Honour. Now, this book was published in many editions, and what makes it so fascinating to us is that in the space of just a few years, it constantly changed its account of whether James existed or not and what his situation was. In 1718, which was the earliest edition I could get a hold of and possibly the first one, it said that young Charles, Duke of Queensberry and Dover, had only one brother called George, born in 1701, and their 2 sisters. James was persona non grata. In the 1719 edition, though, we get one of the most important bits of evidence in the whole video. For, although its information is a little outdated as it indicates that James was still alive at that point, it says that Charles had inherited the dukedom and that James is styled Marquis of Drumlanrig and is 1 year older than the Duke, but being of an infirm constitution, both of body and mind, the honours of the family were settled by his father with consent and confirmation of the crown on Charles the present Duke. This is the best evidence I've found that the succession of the family was indeed changed because of James's health problems, though it doesn't come from a source within the family itself or from any official channel like a government document. It also provides extra, near-contemporary confirmation that James had mental health problems, adding to that there was a physical issue as well. I suspect that the Douglas family weren't happy about the airing of these matters, though, for later editions of Nichol's work in the 1720s don't mention them again. In 1721, James's existence was acknowledged, but no details given. In 1725, the book alluded to the second Duke of Queensberry's large family, but mentioned by name only Charles, who Nichols said was the second son, thereby eliminating James's existence altogether once again. Yet in 1729, the book had course-corrected once more by writing that James was the second son and was born at London November 12, 1697, and in his father's lifetime styled Earl of Drumlanrig, but is dead. No mention of a death date, though, despite the fact that Nichols is otherwise very good at providing such details. It's all very fishy, gang. So what do I think is happening here, and what title do I think James had at the time of his death? Well, my take on this, and bear in mind that it could well change if better sources ever come to my attention, is that he really did have some sort of mental health issue and that he died in 1715. I think this explanation is the one which best ties together the evidence I've been able to find, from the titles given to his little brother in 1706 to the special entail to Charles written into the Dukedom of Dover when it was granted to their father in 1708, to the death records from 1715 and their mention of him being an imbecile. As for his title, it seems, and I could be wrong here, it's difficult to unpick exactly what went on, that although the Dukedom of Dover had been created in such a way as to skip over James entirely, and the Dukedom of Queensberry had likely been amended to do the same, even though that wasn't my understanding of the only official document I found relating to that issue, the inheritance rules around the Marquisate of Queensberry, which was an earlier title the family had held before being upgraded to dukes, were certainly not changed in 1706, and so it was able to descend to him in 1711 when his father died. Thus, when James died a few years later, he was the third Marquis. This is the conclusion also reached in the excellent and very extensive academic publication, The History of Parliament, the House of Commons 1690 to 1715. Written by professional historians who have more than 3 days to do their research and writing, unlike yours truly, it notes in its entry for Dumfriesshire that the death of Queensberry in July 1711 signalled a lengthy eclipse of the Douglas power. There was a confused succession followed by a dynastic hiatus. The titles were divided between the eldest son, who was an idiot, and his younger brother, who was still a minor, while the estates passed intact to the latter. Honestly, this is good enough for me, and it would help to explain too the confusion in the death record and one edition of Nicholl's book, which spliced together James's various titles to call him the Marquis of Drumlanrig. There's a bit of supposition in here though, because as I said earlier, I'm really not 100% sure what the motives behind the surrender and regrant of most of the Queensberry titles and lands in 1706 were, though James' problems do seem a likely reason, and honestly, I'm not sure that I read all the relevant paperwork either. I'm at the mercy of what I could find digitised and placed online, which is not ideal, and I imagine that if time and access to archives weren't an issue, one could probably track down more information on this story from old letters and other documents. Whatever happened to James, it seems that his fate was kept very quiet by his family. So quiet, in fact, that later writers either genuinely didn't know what had happened to him or felt pressurised by the very high-status Douglas family to fudge the details, probably due to embarrassment at having had a mentally disabled relation. We'll likely never know what his exact issue was, and honestly, it could have been any of a huge number of medical conditions. Perhaps he had Down syndrome or a severe case of autism. Maybe he was brain damaged from a difficult birth, or just happened to have a low IQ for some other reason. We just don't know. As for the cannibal story, as I've already said, I simply don't believe, on the basis of the evidence provided, that it happened. I saw a Reddit thread from 2025 with someone claiming to provide some additional evidence that James was mad and had been violent, but the sources listed either couldn't be checked or were demonstrably false, like fictitious quotes from the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Maxwell's book, and the journals of Lord Fountainhall, the last of which only goes up to 1676, 21 years before James was born, and so can't possibly discuss him. I mention this only so that if you Google this story and come across that thread, you aren't suckered by it. I hope you found that study of Scotland's supposed child cannibal Earl interesting. Let me know below if you think James Douglas really did murder, roast and eat one of the household servants. And for another slightly more secure tale of aristocratic cannibalism, watch my video on the mother who ate her own son, possibly at Windsor Castle, next. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.